Okay, well, we're going to try this. We've obviously missed a few days from the snow and all that. This isn't the best situation, but we'll try and use this method and technique to get through some of the stuff that we won't have a whole lot of time to deal with in class. So I'm going to be talking for a while to you about Assignment 6 in Unit 8, and that's the assignment dealing with urbanization. Urbanization and industrialization really happened at the same time, and they had to. I really don't know of any civilization or society ever in the history of the world that's industrialized without also urbanizing. Number one, you need a centralized labor supply to work in your factories and mills. Well, that means that people are going to have to live close enough to be able to get back and forth to and from work on foot every day. You didn't have cars, obviously. Also, the city will provide a market for the products produced by that factory or other industrial setup. So you have your labor supply and your market for your goods sitting right there for you. So what's going on is, as the 19th century continues after the Civil War, and as industrialization picks up and as it becomes more and more intense and widespread, urbanization does the same thing. So by 1900, you have 40% of the population in the United States living in urban settings. Now that's quite a change from the traditionally and largely agrarian society that we've had up to that point. By 1920 census shows that for the first time in American history, those living in urban settings outnumbered those living in rural settings. So, in that decade two-decade period between 1900 and 1920, you see the urban population go from about 40% of the total to about 51% of the total. Okay. What we're going to talk about next is the changes in the nature of cities that took place in order to make them more amenable to the industrial era that we're talking about. You needed to have improvements in transportation for cities to get bigger. Because there's really, one way for a city to expand in a geographic sense, and that's out from the center. Now, we'll also talk about in a minute, it can also expand up in space, but as far as, if you want to build new buildings and what have you, you've got to expand outward. Well, if you expand outward beyond the distance that can be served by your existing transportation system, it's not going to do you any good. So you're going to have to develop a new sort of transportation infrastructure in order to make large-scale urbanization effective, I guess is the best way to put it. Basically, before the Civil War, city size was dictated by how far you could walk in a reasonable amount of time. So workers in pre-Civil War cities had to live within walking distance. And that top, I would say, would be about 2.5 miles from the center of the city. They called that the old walking city. Okay, that's about as far out from the center of the city as you could go and still be able to get to and from work on a daily basis in a reasonable amount of time. Okay? What comes in after the Civil War that's going to change that is the development of streetcars. First horse-drawn streetcars on tracks, and then by the 1880s, we're talking about electric streetcars. Okay, that's going to really allow the expansion of the cities in size. Okay, and what happened with that is you had the cities expand in almost concentric circles out from the center of the city. And this, and you can see this, I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this, but I have that sort of inner circle to the first circle out being the walking distance. What would happen then is, as they built the streetcar lines would radiate out from the center of the city to the surrounding areas, kind of like that. Okay? Now, what this ended up doing, in addition to allowing the city to spread out from the center, is it also led to neighborhoods being segregated by income levels. That wasn't the case in earlier city development, because what you'd have is you might have a more affluent neighborhood right next to a working class neighborhood. But that's going to change, because in order to live far enough out from the city to merit using streetcars, okay, beyond the limits of the old walking city, you're going to need to be able to afford the streetcar fares. Okay? The further out you live, the higher the streetcar fares are. So what ends up happening is, the further out you went on the streetcar line, the higher the fares were, and so the income level on average of people that lived in those areas gets correspondingly higher. So the further out from the center of the city you go, the wealthier the people are. And, you know, in some cities you can still see evidence. You can see that in Baltimore. If you go to Catonsville, and, for example, you start, you know, in Catonsville down close to the city line, and you take Frederick Road, for example, and you drive out from the city through Catonsville out toward Howard County, out toward Ellicott City, you have to use your imagination. But if you look as you're traveling out, you'll start to see that the older buildings, if you focus on the older buildings, the further out you go, the bigger and the more ornate they get. Now, they're not used as homes anymore. Most of them are divided up into businesses and office space and apartments or what have you. But you can see these sort of older Victorian homes the further out you go. And that's evidence. That's evidence what I'm talking about. That's because that road, Frederick Road there, is built along what used to be the old streetcar lines, one of the old streetcar lines radiating out from the center of the city. So that's going to segregate workers by income. And you're going to have the creation of what became known as streetcar suburbs. As a matter of fact, I've got a book right here that was written, you probably can't see it that well, by Sam Bass Warner, I believe, back in the 1970s. And he took a look at Boston in his book, Streetcar Suburbs. Talks a lot about that very thing. Okay, so we talked about cities expanding outward, the use of streetcars. They also expanded up. And we're going to see in the post-Civil War period the development of the first American skyscrapers. Now, you needed technology to advance to be able to do that. Basically, the highest you could build a building prior to the advances in technology was probably 4 or 5 stories. Okay, you had to develop better ways of making stronger, lighter steel. Okay, you had to be able to build a framework, a skeleton, out of steel girders that was strong enough to hold up the size building you're trying to hold up, but also was light enough so that it wouldn't collapse in on itself. And it was not until that was done that you could start going up above, say, 4, 5, 6 stories in a building safely. The other thing that developed was concrete. They came up with ways to make concrete that was strong and ways to make it effectively and cheaply. So once you had steel, the right kind of steel, and concrete set to go, then you could build what we now call skyscrapers.